education at the library, and delighted to welcome you here to this event tonight, which is part of our event series for our current exhibition, Looted: Two Families, Nazi Theft and the Search for Restitution. So we have another exhibition event coming up, and you can find out more details of that online. So if you're interested in that, then have a look at that as well. So just a couple of words of housekeeping. Should the fire alarm sound, the only fire exit is at the front of the building, so just leave by the route which you came. The toilets are in the basement, and to access them, you need to leave this room by the door you came in, go along the corridor to the back and take the lift to the basement. So we're going to be hearing tonight from a couple of speakers, but I think first of all, we're going to hear from the curators of this wonderful exhibition, which I must say has been getting good audiences, really brilliant feedback. So it's been really amazing to bring this here to the Wiener Holocaust Library. So I'll hand over now to Helen Davey and Katharina Meyerhofer, and they are going to continue tonight's event. So I don't know, yeah.
Thank you, Barbara. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Thanks for braving strikes and torrential rain. Welcome. We're really glad you've joined us today at this event in connection with our exhibition Looted, co-curated between Katharina and myself. We will be guiding you through the evening. We have two speakers that we'll introduce in just a moment, and I'll just hand over to Katharina.
Yeah, thank you. We are honored to welcome two renowned historians. One is here, the other one is lost in traffic, but is coming hopefully very soon. And from Austria they are, and both of whom have contributed to this exhibition. They will share their research and perspectives, highlighting both the broader lines of restitution and memory culture, as well as local historical contexts.
Just before we begin, we'd like to warmly thank our partners who made the evening possible. Obviously, the Wiener Holocaust Library, Dr. Barbara and Clara, the head and assistant curators, the Austrian Cultural Forum, Arts Council England, and the Austrian Federal Ministry, who gave their financial support. So without their support, an event like this exhibition, and this event in particular, wouldn't have been possible.
Yeah, and we are hearing now Dr. Birgit Kirchmayer. She's a historian, associate professor at Johannes Kepler University in Linz, expert in art restitution, a member of the Commission for Provenience Research in Austria, and co-author of Restituted, 25 Years of Art Restitution Law in Austria. Yeah, well then, I'll give you the microphone. Yeah, and now we hear now we hear the speech, Art Restitution in Austria from 1945 to the present, by Birgit Kirchmayer.
An overview and some reflections on returning and preserving memory. The whole title. So good evening. I'm honored to be here. I want to thank both of you for inviting me, and I want to thank the Wiener Library, Holocaust Library, for this kind invitation. And I'm honored that you came here in this evening and under this not so easy circumstances here in London today with the traffic. So, okay. Maybe before I start my lecture, I want to say one sentence why I'm here and why I'm here in this context with Katharina and Helen. So Katharina told me about this project, I guess 2 years ago or some about that, and I have to say I was really flashed from the first moment on. I think it's a really exceptional project Katharina and Helen did, and so I'm very happy and delighted to give here a form of contribution to your work, and I will speak about art restitution in Austria and the situation nowadays and in the past. And I want to start with a movie. Maybe you know the movie Monuments Men. In the movie Monuments Men with George Clooney and Hugh Bonneville, which tells the story of the Allied art protection units during World War II, this is how the restitution of looted art works. Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives officer James Granger, portrayed by actor Matt Damon, enters a depot in Paris where works of art stolen from Jews by the Nazi occupiers are stored. He picks up a painting, turns it around, and finds a small label on the back with a name and the address. He looks for the address and finds an empty apartment, obviously robbed. The bright spots on the wall where the works of art were hanging are still visible. Officer Granger looks for the painting's original place and hangs it back on the nail. Object returned, mission accomplished. So, of course, this is a movie, and it seems clear that in real life and decades later, it is substantially more difficult to identify the owners of Nazi seized or stolen art. But from my point of view, the described scene is interesting for several reasons. Restitution, in the original sense of the Latin word restituere, means returning something to its original state. Was the painting in the movie restituted in this sense? Obviously, it is hanging again on the same nail from which it was previously removed. But has it been restored to its original state? In Monuments Men, the actress Kate Blanchett embodies Claire Simon, a character inspired by the French art historian Rose Valland, who was an important figure in the restitution of art looted from France during the Second World War. In the movie, Simon accuses Officer Granger of naivety. The owners of the painting would no longer be here, and they would not come back. In doing so, she points to a central fact. Restitution, in the sense of returning something to its original state, is impossible in the context of the Holocaust. Her objection that Granger's actions are naive is therefore more than justified. Granger's response, however, provides another angle on the issue. My job is to find art and to return it, and it seems like a good place to start. And he's probably right about that too. So, a looted work of art cannot be returned to its original state if its owners were expelled, persecuted, or murdered. This was impossible immediately after the end of the war in 1945, and it is even more impossible 80 years and generations later. Hardly any of the victims are still alive, and even restitution to children is rare. More often it is grandchildren or relatives or other legal successors. It is not uncommon for these late restitutions to trigger an intensive examination of the family history, the history of persecution of the ancestors. The more time has passed, the more difficult the process of restitution becomes. On the part of the returnees to identify and find the former owners and their heirs, and on the part of the descendants to find their former possessions scattered across various institutions and private owners. Although increasing digitalization, networking, and professionalization of provenance research are opening up new possibilities of both levels, making cases suddenly solvable after many decades, restitution remains fraught with difficulties. In her book, Was heilt Kunst, which roughly translates to What Heals Art, Legal expert Sophie Schönberger calls attention to a largely neglected aspect of restitution, namely its two-sided nature as a social process. In other words, giving back requires someone to take back the object. This also shifts when several decades have passed and the perspectives of the other party diverge. The expectations associated with restitution do not always coincide on both sides involved. Maybe there is a group of people who are to receive something back, which also can be difficult. So there can be cases when a late restitution may come too late and is simply not or no longer wanted, accepted, or understood by the other party. The objects themselves may also experience a dramatic shift over time, if not physically, then in their perceived economic or emotional value. The stars of today's art restitutions, typically famous works by Gustav Klimt or Egon Schiele, are fetching exceptionally high prices nowadays, whereas at the time of their seizure or sequestration, they were much less valuable in economic terms. Similarly, the emotional symbolic value of works of art may change over time. Descendants often describe the special meaning that emanates from restituted objects. In many cases, this is perceived positively as something that was felt to be missing from one's own. However, it can also be painful and disturbing, and maybe it's both. Stephen Mautner, one of the heirs of the once Aryanized collection of his grandparents, Anna and Konrad Mautner, which was restituted in 2017 by the Viennese Volkskundemuseum. Stephen writes about the restitution process as an intense and rewarding journey in many ways. Maria Hochreiter, grandniece and heir of the Viennese collector Moritz Grünebaum, compares her family history with a jigsaw puzzle with a lot of missing links, and the restitution of her uncle's collection from the Wien Museum and the Albertina helped in finding at least some of them. This is one of the reasons why, from my point of view, there is no reasonable alternative but to endeavor to return stolen art, even after such a long time, and even when it's too little and too late. The framework for this today is provided by the Washington Principles, adopted in 1998. Maybe you know them. It's a declaration calling on all participating nations to make every effort to identify Nazi looted art and to find a, quote, just and fair solution, which is for sure a little vague. Furthermore, in Austria was passed the Art Restitution Act in the same year. Unlike the non-binding Washington Principles, the Austrian Restitution Act from 1998 is a law, and it obliges Austrian museums to proactive provenance research. It was a long way to get there. For many decades, Austria saw itself as the first victim of Nazi aggression and has assumed an ambivalent role in the restitution of seized objects. Although there were legal avenues for restitution in the first decade after the end of the war, the situation was very complicated for those affected. Former owners had to submit their claims in accordance with the complex restitution law. A large number of laws were intended to enable the restitution of real estate and movable assets, such as artworks, but only based on so-called RAM restitution, so restitution in kind. This meant that if a work of art no longer existed or was missing or lost, there was no compensation. However, only in a select few cases, did the former owners know where their property was. The less well-known or less valuable an object was, so for example, a table, like in this case, the more difficult it was to find and to prove ownership. This is aggravated by the fact that the government was not always very helpful. On the contrary, some legal principles put pressure on the victims themselves again. The export prohibition law in Austria, originally of 1918, was used as a means of exerting pressure, as owners who were restituted valuable collections of art were required to donate some of them in exchange for being allowed to take others out of the country. This happened in the 1950s and 1960s. A first Art and Cultural Settlement Act was established in 1969. This applied to the so-called Mauerbach artworks, about 960 paintings and other leftovers from the Allied Munich art collecting point, which were given to Austria in 1952. The Federal Office for the Protection of Monuments stored these objects in the former monastery of Mauerbach near Vienna. And no efforts were made on behalf of the state to identify the provenance of these objects. When Simon Wiesenthal heard about this, he informed the responsible ministry, and it was at his insistence that the Art and Cultural Settlement Act was passed, which confirmed the right to reclaim these art objects in a period leading up to December 1970. Apart from the short time frame, one of the main difficulties was that the applicants themselves had to prove that they or their families had formerly owned these properties, which in practice was very difficult, if not entirely impossible. With the former owners often dead, murdered, or forced to emigrate, documents and proof of ownership were frequently missing. And even if the required conditions were met, it did not seem to be a top political priority to comprehensively restitute stolen works of art. It was a very small number of restitutions following the first Art and Cultural Settlement Act of 1969. Some years later, it was after an article in the magazine Art News entitled "A Legacy of Shame" that momentum returned in the 1980s. The author, Andrew Decker, described Austria's handling of art stolen by the National Socialists as, I cite, characterized by neglect, ineptness, and questionable legal maneuvers. This article brought the issue into the international spotlight and initiated a second Art and Cultural Property Restitution Act, which was passed in December 1985 and was hardly more successful than the previous one. The next step followed in 1995, when the ownership rights to the Mauerbach art objects were transferred to the Jewish community of Austria. In turn, the Jewish community initiated in 1996 a large-scale auction at Christie's in Vienna, with the proceeds going to victims of the Shoah. In the course of the auction, some restitutions were made as former owners rediscovered their paintings in the auction catalogue. While it was the political aim to put an end to the debate on Nazi-looted art with this auction, in fact, the opposite proved true. Among other factors, the global political changes in the wake of 1989 and German reunification revived the issue of compensation and restitution policy in Europe in the 1990s in general. Historical commissions were set up to examine controversial questions relating to the unresolved history of National Socialism. While in Switzerland, a debate arose about Nazi looted gold and so-called dormant accounts of Nazi victims, the topic of forced labor compensation was discussed in Germany. And in Austria, only not even 2 years after the Mauerbach auction, the confiscation of 4 paintings by Egon Schiele from the Viennese Leopold collection at an exhibition in New York in December 1997 reignited the debate about Nazi looted art. As a consequence, a new art restitution law, the aforementioned Art Restitution Act of 1998, was passed that differs a lot from the former ones. Almost coinciding with the adoption of the Washington Principle, Austria thus created a legal framework that requires state museums and collections for systematically search their holdings for Nazi looted art. This is conducted through the Commission for Provenance Research, which submits cases to the Art Restitution Advisory Board before the latter makes restitution recommendations. Thousands, really thousands of objects have been restituted over the past 25 years based on this law. Valuable Klimt paintings, as well as graphics, books, some other objects. You can find all the recommendations, all the objects on the website of the Commission of Provenance. So, while the Art Restitution Act offers the legal framework for restitution of objects in state museums and collections, there is nothing equivalent for objects in private ownership. But one can state that in recent years, there has been a growing unease at the thought of possibly possessing contaminated objects or works of art. Items inherited from grandparents, bought in art shops or at auctions that are suspected of having been stolen from their previous owners are increasingly viewed critically, and many people feel the wish or need to return them. Ideally, the desire to give back is combined with an active confrontation with the unjust past and creates some such wonderful projects as that of Katharina and Helen. So restitution is more than a transfer of ownership. It has become a deeply political act of remembrance. Although restitution today cannot restore the original situation, it can make a key contribution to the attempt of correcting unjust property relations and preserve history from oblivion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to introduce Florian Schwanninger. Florian Schwanninger is a historian, director of the Schloss Hartheim Remembrance Centre, researcher on resistance, persecution and extermination in Upper Austria with a special focus on local Nazi history. So, yeah, we are happy to hear you speak.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry. I apologize for being late. A bicycle would have been better to come here than a taxi. That was definitely the wrong decision to take a taxi, so please apologize. I have to read my lecture because my English is not good enough to speak free. And I will give you some information now about the looting, about the so-called Aryanization in Ranshofen, Braunau, the city of Braunau, the region Braunau. And thank you thank you for the opportunity to give this speech. I'm delighted to be here today and to have the opportunity to give this speech. Thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you very much to the organizers here at the Wiener Library. And thank you very much, Helen and Katharina, for putting together this wonderful project and exhibition. I have a strong biographical connection to the region around Braunau, where I grew up and I went to school there. And I must say that I only learned about the Wertheimer family and their persecution during the Nazi era very late in life. No one talked about it, not even in history class. Everyone knows about the huge aluminium factory on the grounds of the Ranshofen estate, but nowhere was there any mention of the fact that it belonged to the Wertheimers or what happened to this family. It was only towards the end of my history studies in the early 2000 years that I came across this story. It was also during this time that the first studies mentioning the so-called Aryanization appeared. The story of the Wertheimer family was one of those stories that motivated me that time to write my thesis on resistance and persecution in the Braunau district from 1938 to 1945. Most of these were stories that were rarely told, or at least had not been told to me, as I said, neither in history lessons nor in the media. But now we must go back to the year 1938, to a day whose drastic consequences cannot be overestimated. On the afternoon of 12th March 1938, Adolf Hitler crossed the Inn Bridge in Braunau, around 4 kilometers from Schloss Ranshofen. And he arrived at his birthplace of Braunau to great cheers. The Führer and Reichskanzler stayed only briefly and traveled on to Linz. The jubilation was indescribable. The bells rang. The 120-kilometer journey from Braunau to Linz was like a triumphal ride. We made slower progress than expected. This is how his Air Force adjutant described the atmosphere along the route on this day. Impressed by the enthusiastic reception, Hitler decided that evening in Linz to immediately annex his former homeland to the German Reich. That was not really planned before, to annex it immediately. For political opponents of the Nazis and the Jewish population, or those defined as Jews by the Nazi regime, a period of persecution began immediately. The Austrian provinces, the rural areas away from the cities, away from the metropolis of Vienna, were not to be exempt from this. According to the 1934 census, there were about 191,000 people of Jewish confession or of Mosaic confession, as it was commonly called in Austria. That was 2.8% of the total population. The majority of them lived in the capital Vienna. By March 1938, the number had fallen to about 182,000. The National Socialists considered an additional 25,000 people to be Jews. In March 1938, there were fewer than 1,000 people of Jewish confession living in Upper Austria. They made up only 0.09% of the total population. According to the National Socialists' definition, the percentage was higher. Statistics from 1941 recorded 1,025 people who were considered Jewish, only 92 of whom were of Jewish confession. According to this list, 22 people who were affected by the racial laws lived in the Landkreis Braunau am Inn, as the district of Braunau was called from January 1st, 1939. 17 of them were considered so-called Mischlinge. I don't know probably can be translated as half-breeds. 5 of them so-called Volljuden, full Jews. None of them were of Jewish confession anymore. Considering the population of the Braunau district, about 63,000 people lived there in 1941. This was a very small proportion of people who were considered Jewish. Nevertheless, this small group was marginalized, dispossessed, and persecuted from the very beginning. Unlike in Linz, for example, there are no known acts of violence in the Braunau region during the November pogroms of 1938. However, as elsewhere, the Nazi regime and parts of the population proceeded with speed to dispossess Jewish people and rob them of their possessions under the term Arisierung, Aryanization. The regional authorities were instructed to register the so-called Jewish assets. The owners were put under pressure and threatened with imprisonment in concentration camps if they did not agree or sell. Members of the Nazi Party tried to use their influence to profit from this, such as taking over the branch of a so-called Jewish shoe store in the town of Braunau. The medical counselor, Dr. Samuel Neumann, again had to sell a house in Braunau at a low price to a politically acceptable buyer, as it was called, who had wanted to buy the house before the Anschluss, but he was unable to raise the money at the time. In the Braunau region too, spouses in mixed marriages tried to escape the so-called Aryanization by transferring the property of the Jewish partner to the Aryan partner. The threats and repression also led to a wave of suicides. People were put under pressure to leave their former homes and go abroad, and pressure was put on so-called Aryan spouses in mixed marriages to divorce their Jewish partners. This led, for example, to Dr. Arthur Herzfeld, who lived in Minning, a village not far away from Braunau, attempting suicide in July 1939. This failed, and Dr. Herzfeld was saved. He survived the Nazi era. In Mosbach, another village not far away, Dr. Leopold Flato took his own life in order to protect his Aryan wife from potential persecution. Even the fact of having been baptized decades ago and, for example, having honorary citizenship of a municipality in the Braunau district, the village of Munderfing, did not protect in the slightest, as in the case of Alexander Brüll. Alexander Brüll had to flee to Switzerland, and his sawmill was taken over by proven National Socialists and members of the SS. Brüll received nothing from the proceeds of the sale, as was generally the case with Aryanizations. By far, the most extensive case of Aryanization in the Braunau region was that of the Wertheimer family estate in the village of Ranshofen. Ranshofen became part of the town of Braunau in 1938, following its incorporation. Originally owned by the Jewish Wertheimer family since 1851, the former Ranshofen monastery was for a long time a model farm of considerable size. Around 70 farm workers were employed on the estate in the early 1930s. In the 1930s, the estate was owned by several members of the Wertheimer family. Due to unsuccessful stock market transactions, one half had to be auctioned off in 1934. The buyers were the Braunau and Ried im Innkreis Sparkasse, a regional savings bank. The second half remained in the possession of the Wertheimer daughters Anna Schiff, Emilie Jelinek, and Gabriele Weisweiler. The global economic crisis had, at least temporarily, also a negative impact on the economic situation of the estate. In the years that followed, the situation recovered. March 1938 was a massive turning point. The 3 owners of half of the estate were considered Jews according to the racial laws. Based on the decree of April 26, 1938, the Wertheimer heiresses reported their assets on July 15, 1938. Smaller assets such as luxury items, silver, jewelry, securities, etc., also had to be declared. According to a report by the Jelinek couple from 1940, the owners were no longer able to exert any influence on the management of the business. And I quote Stefan Jelinek, but had to calmly accept the fact that unauthorized elements made dispositions that they were unable to prevent. This concerned, for example, the proceeds from the sale of the harvest and other products, and in the summer of 1938, the stables began to empty, as Stefan and Emilie Jelinek put it in a memorandum in 1940. The house was occupied by foreign elements. Boxes were broken in two, laundry and furnishings were stolen. The Wertheimer heresies received support from the Catholic priest of Ranshofen, Johann Hagen. He had always been a guest at Sunday lunch. According to Anna Schiff's daughter, he had the Wertheimer family papers he hid the Wertheimer family papers after the Anschluss. Even before the Anschluss, Hagen, the priest, was considered a fierce opponent of the National Socialists. The furnishings of the Schloss, which was a residential house, also had to be sold in the summer of 1938. A so-called kommissarischer Verwalter, a provisional administrator, was finally appointed to manage the estate on October 17, 1938. The owners did not receive any information from him. In May 1938, Sparkasse Ried organized a meeting with the owners in Vienna. They were informed that the Sparkasse banks in Ried and Braunau wanted to buy the half of the estate belonging to the three sisters. The Sparkasse director exerted pressure. The selling price had to be lowered. The estate was allegedly in a poor condition because the owners had gained so-called financial advantages. Stefan Jelinek, Emilia Jelinek's husband, stated in the restitution proceedings after 1945 that he had been threatened with immediate imprisonment if they had not wanted to sell. The background to the sale was the plan by Vereinigte Aluminiumwerke Berlin, the aluminium factories of Berlin, to build a huge aluminium plant in the forest of the Ranshofen estate between Braunau and the neighboring village Neukirchen. The favorable ownership conditions played an important role in the local decision, as it was possible to acquire large areas of so-called Jewish property at the favorable price and avoid laborious negotiations with smaller so-called Aryan owners, who would have been the case elsewhere. After negotiations, during which great pressure was exerted, the sale was completed. Also, the initiative for the sale had initially come from the Sparkasse. VW Berlin, the aluminium plant, now came onto the scene as the buyer. According to the purchase agreement dated August 12, 1939, the three Wertheimer heresies now received 29.5% of the purchase price from the Vereinigte Aluminiumwerke, while the Sparkasse received 70.5%. At this time, the Weisweiler and Jelinek families had already emigrated to England. Construction of the aluminium plant had already begun in the spring of 1939. By August 18, 1939, the day the Jelinek couple left for England, according to Stefan Jelinek, I quote, "The sale had not been completed and the purchase price had not been paid." The three owners never received the purchase price of about 128,000 Reichsmark. Part of the amount went into so-called Auswanderer-Sperrkonten. This can be translated with emigrant blocked accounts. The rest was withheld as so-called Reichsfluchtsteuer, Reich Flight Tax, and so-called Judenvermögensabgabe, Jewish property tax. The The unequal division of the purchase price was justified in an expert opinion from September 1939 by the fact that the Sparkasse had made losses in the course of the forced sale in 1935. In 1934. No net profit had been achieved as a result. It was therefore justified that the Sparkasse had received more than half, because according to a valuation report, I quote, "It is clear that under these circumstances, the Jewish half must let their hair down, because the savings banks were driven into the given situation by Jewish speculation, and the Ranshofen business was severely damaged in its management by these Jewish shenanigans." Whether the savings banks acted on their own initiative cannot be determined with certainty. In any case, the district leader of the Nazi Party and mayor of Braunau, Fritz Reithofer, also acted as chairman of the Sparkassen Committee. In April 1941, the town of Braunau finally concluded an agreement on a land swap, with which it came into possession of Schloss Ranshofen. In addition to the financial losses, the three heiresses also suffered personal persecution, and in one case even ended up being murdered during the Holocaust. Emilia Jelinek and Gabriele Weisweiler had to go into exile in England, while Anna Schiff was murdered in Auschwitz in 1942. In the restitution proceedings after 1945, the surviving sisters and their husbands found it difficult to assert their rights. The municipality of Braunau wanted to claim that the Ranshofen estate had been purchased by the Aluminiumwerke in 1939, I quote, "for purely economic reasons, but not for racial or national reasons." Sparkasse Braunau denied that the Wertheimer daughters had been subjected to coercion. The sale had taken place independently of the Nazi regime. The aluminium plant VAW Ranshofen, which was nationalized after 1945, claimed that they had only become aware of the previous Jewish owners after the purchase. However, they were the only part to make an offer of compensation on their own initiative. In rem restitution was rejected, as the plant was of great importance to the Austrian economy, and the investment costs were disproportionate to the market value of the Ranshofen estate. A settlement was finally reached on November 18, 1949. The Vereinigte Aluminiumwerke Ranshofen, the municipality of Braunau, and the Sparkasse paid certain sums to the Wertheimer heirs. Personal belongings of the Wertheimer family, furnishings, and other valuable objects were not mentioned in these proceedings. The aluminium plant, which had actually been built for the German armament industry and the Luftwaffe, remained one of Austria's most important industrial enterprises, even after 1945. It became part of the so-called Wirtschaftswunder. The circumstances surrounding its creation, such as the employment of prisoners of war and forced laborers, and above all, the fate of the Wertheimer family, were at most disturbing details. It would take decades before these events were addressed in public, in the media, and in historical research. And to come back to the beginning, it is very nice to see that the family level is being addressed in the form of this great project. Thank you very much for your attention.